They thought exiled killer human to a lifeless station. He refused to die and rebuild. The airlock made a sound like a broken bone snapping when it sealed behind me. I stood in that narrow corridor and listened to the sound fade into nothing, and I understood exactly what the Galactic Conclave had intended. They had not sent me to prison. They had sent me to a place where silence was the last thing I would ever hear. My name is Cale Dorn. 14 years ago I was a decorated soldier. 9 years ago I was a celebrated commander. 4 days ago I was convicted of crimes that 7 alien species invented, specifically to describe what I had done during a war that humanity had not started and could not afford to lose. Now I was standing inside an abandoned orbital station called Necros 9, which orbited no useful planet, generated no heat of its own, and had not been occupied by any living creature in 6 years. My suit told me the internal temperature was minus 41 degrees. My suit told me I had 58 hours of oxygen remaining. My suit told me the structural integrity of the section I was standing in was rated at 32%. I took a breath, which cost me a fraction of those 58 hours, and I started walking. The corridor ran straight for about 40 meters before bending left. Every surface was coated in a thin layer of frost that caught the beam of my helmet light and threw it back in pale blue fragments. The Conclave had stripped the station of everything useful before they handed it to me. Or rather, they had stripped everything they believed to be useful. They had catalogued the station using Salathi methodology, which meant they were looking for what a Salathi would need to survive. The Salathi were careful, precise, and deeply uncomfortable with disorder. They were also the species that had spent 2 decades quietly engineering the circumstances that led to humanity's worst war, and they had done it because careful and precise species plan ahead, and they had decided that a manageable humanity was better than an uncontrolled one. They had not considered what I might be looking for. I turned the bend and found the first useful thing within 3 minutes. It was not impressive. It was a ruptured secondary power coupling, dangling from the ceiling like a dead vine, half melted and corroded by some chemical reaction that had destroyed whatever ran through it years ago. A Salathi technician would have logged it as salvage-grade waste and moved on. I stopped and pulled it free from the ceiling and held it in my gloved hands and turned it slowly. The casing was destroyed. The core filament, the actual conductive element that made the thing work, was intact. It was about 30 centimeters long and thinner than my little finger. It was also, according to a design principle that human engineers had been using for decades, and that alien manufacturers had not adopted because it looked inelegant, capable of carrying 3 times the load rating stamped on the outside of the housing. Human engineering had one philosophy that alien engineering did not: build the thing to survive its own failure. I put the filament in my cargo pocket and kept walking. The station had 7 decks. I had been deposited on Deck 3, which was the central operations level, and I worked my way downward first, because heat settles in sealed environments, and the lower decks of a station like this tended to retain marginally more warmth. Marginally. We were talking about minus 38 instead of minus 41. It was not comfort. It was math. But math had kept me alive before when nothing else was available. Deck 4 was a laboratory level. The Salathi had conducted atmospheric research here before the reactor incident that prompted the evacuation. They had taken their equipment. They had not taken the infrastructure, the ventilation housings, the sealed specimen lockers, the emergency pressure bulkheads. I found 11 specimen lockers still sealed along one wall. I also found a ventilation housing that had been installed with a bypass manifold I recognized as a model used in human-built environmental systems, which meant whoever had installed it had either been human or had been trained by someone human. They had built in a maintenance override that the Salathi catalogers had not noticed because it was hidden behind a panel that looked like decorative hull plating. I opened the panel with my utility knife and found a manual power junction. It was not connected to anything yet, but it could be. I moved on. I was building a map in my head, not just of the physical layout, but of what this place could become. What the station looked like right now was almost irrelevant. What mattered was what it could be turned into, given time, and the right decisions made in the right sequence. I had been a commander long enough to know that the gap between a disaster and a workable situation was almost always a matter of perspective and priority. You looked at what you had. You decided what you needed first. You did that thing. Then you decided what you needed second. You kept going until there was nothing left to do, or until you ran out of time. I did not intend to run out of time. Deck 5 was a storage level that had been mostly emptied. Mostly, I found 4 pressurized containers stacked in a corner behind a collapsed shelving unit. They were made of a ceramic composite that the Salathi used for biological containment, which meant they were rated to survive temperatures and pressures that would destroy conventional storage. I checked the manifest codes on each one. 3 were labeled in Salathi script as organic samples, classification 2. 1 was labeled as mechanical spares. The mechanical spares container was the size of my torso and heavier than I expected when I shifted it. I did not open it yet. I noted its location and kept moving. Deck 6 had nothing I needed immediately, but I cataloged every component I could see through the frost and the debris. Deck 7, the lowest level, was where the maintenance infrastructure lived. Most of it was dark. The emergency lighting had been reduced to a single dim strand running along the floor, barely enough to see by. I nearly missed the door at the far end of the maintenance corridor. It was not on any manifest I had been given. The Conclave had provided me with a station schematic as part of the legal formality of the exile. They were required by galactic law to give me documentation of the place they were sending me. The schematic showed this corridor terminating in a hull wall. The door existed anyway. It had no lock mechanism on the outside. That told me it was designed to be accessed from the inside, which meant someone had gone in and not come back out, or someone had built a room that was never meant to be entered from the direction I was approaching it from. I examined the seam around the door for about 2 minutes. Then I took the filament from my pocket, pressed it flat against the seam at the upper right corner, where power junctions were typically located in conclave-era construction, and applied a very specific amount of pressure. The door clicked. I pulled it open. The room behind it was small, 4 meters by 4 meters, and it was not empty. Mounted on a stabilization cradle that was bolted through the deck plating sat a reactor core. Not a standard one. Not the type listed in the station's original construction records. This was a design I had only seen in classified intelligence briefings during the later years of the war. A null core, an experimental power system that the Conclave's science division had been developing for purposes they had not disclosed publicly. The general population of every species in the Conclave had been told that this technology did not yet exist outside of laboratory conditions. It was running. Not at full capacity. Not even at minimal capacity. But somewhere between dead and functional there was a state that human engineers called a cold hum, which meant the core was still cycling, still processing, still alive in the way that a person with a very slow heartbeat is still alive. The Conclave had abandoned this station without knowing this room existed. Or they had known and decided that a dying experimental reactor in a classified room in a station they were using as a disposal site for a human they expected to be dead within 72 hours was not worth the paperwork. Either way, they had made a mistake. I sat down on the floor in front of the null core and did not move for 3 minutes. I was not resting. I was thinking. I was running through everything I had seen in the past hour, building a sequence in my head, and the sequence was beginning to look like something I had not expected to find in this place. It was beginning to look like a possibility. I stood up, went back to Deck 5, and opened the mechanical spares container. Inside, packed in foam insulation, were 17 components. Most were Salathi fabrication parts, standard issue. But 4 of them were power regulation boards of a design I recognized because human engineers had reverse engineered it from a conclave vessel 3 years into the war and had then built an improved version. The improved version was what I was holding. Someone had been here before me. Someone who knew what this station actually contained. Someone who had left supplies for a purpose that had never been fulfilled. I did not know who that was. I did not know why they had not returned. What I knew was that they had done some of the preparation work I would have had to do myself, and that this changed my timeline from almost certainly impossible to merely extremely difficult. I was comfortable with extremely difficult. Extremely difficult was the kind of problem I understood. I spent the next 4 hours working without stopping. I connected the filament from the power coupling to the manual junction I had found in Deck 4. I ran a line from that junction down to the maintenance level using cabling I stripped from non-essential systems on Deck 6. I connected the cabling to the null core's output port using 2 of the 4 regulation boards from the container. Then I went to the gravity plating control panel on Deck 3 and rewired it to draw from the junction, instead of from the main power grid that no longer existed. The manual says you cannot power gravity plating from a secondary junction without triggering a cascade fault that destroys both systems. The manual was written by Solathi engineers. Solathi engineers believe in clean, single-channel power delivery. It is elegant. It is also brittle. Human engineers believe in giving a system 3 ways to do the same job and making sure that if one path fails, the system automatically shifts to the second, and if that fails, the third holds while you figure out what went wrong. I wired the gravity plating with parallel load distribution. It came on. Not fully. Not smoothly. The first 30 seconds it fluctuated between 60 and 80%, which meant my feet were sometimes heavier and sometimes lighter than they should have been. But it stabilized at 72%, which was enough to keep me standing without effort, and that mattered, because working in zero gravity while exhausted and rationing oxygen was a way to make dangerous mistakes. I stood in the middle of Deck 3 and felt the floor push back against my feet, and I allowed myself exactly 1 moment of satisfaction before I moved on to the next problem. The next problem was temperature. The null core was generating heat as a byproduct of its cycling, but the room it was in was sealed, and the heat was not going anywhere useful. I needed to redirect it. The ventilation system was dead, but the housings were intact, and if I could create airflow through the Deck 4 bypass manifold, I could push warm air from the maintenance level upward and create a survivable temperature pocket. This took 2 hours and 3 attempts. The second attempt resulted in me spending 40 minutes flat on my back on the Deck 6 floor, after I connected the manifold bypass in the wrong sequence, causing a pressure differential that slammed one of the ventilation housings shut and locked it. I lay there and thought about it, not about stopping. I want to be precise about that. The idea of giving up did not enter my mind in any form I would call temptation. What entered my mind was pure mechanical problem solving. The housing was locked because the pressure on the inlet side was higher than the pressure on the outlet side. I needed to equalize them. There was no bleed valve in the immediate system. But there was a small access port in the housing's side panel, meant for maintenance tools, and if I threaded the filament through it and manually depressed the locking mechanism from the inside, while simultaneously reducing inlet pressure by partially opening a tertiary duct I had noticed 3 corridors back, it might work. I got up and tried it. It worked. Warm air began moving through the station for the first time in 6 years. It was not much warmth. It was the difference between -38 and -19. But -19 in a sealed corridor, with a functional suit providing additional insulation, meant I could work without my fingers going numb inside my gloves. Small advantage. But this was a place where small advantages were the only kind available, and the way you won with small advantages was by collecting enough of them that they stopped being small. I found a section of Deck 3 that was structurally sound and clear of debris, and I sat down and ate half of my field ration brick. It tasted like compressed cardboard with a faint chemical sweetness, meant to suggest nutrition. I ate slowly, and while I ate I talked to myself, which was something I had done since my training years. My first instructor had told me that soldiers who talked themselves through problems made fewer panic-driven mistakes. I told myself what I had found. I told myself what it meant. I told myself what needed to happen next, in what order, and why each step had to come before the one that followed it. By the time I finished eating, I had a plan that extended 4 weeks forward. It was aggressive. It required things to go right more often than they went wrong. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of plan that the situation called for. I lay down on the floor, closed my eyes, and slept for 5 hours. When I woke up, the station was 2 degrees warmer. The gravity was still running. The air was still moving. Nothing had failed in the night. I checked my oxygen. 41 hours remaining. The oxygen problem had to be solved today. I had known that when I lay down. The specimen lockers on Deck 4 were the answer. 2 of the 3 labeled as organic samples would contain biological material that the Solathi had studied before the evacuation. Standard protocol for organic sample storage was to maintain the container atmosphere in a state that preserved the sample, which for most biological material meant an oxygen-nitrogen mix kept at a ratio very close to what humans breathed. The containers were sealed. The atmosphere inside them had not escaped. They were not large, but if I could access that atmosphere and feed it into the circulation system I had built, I could extend my supply while I worked on a longer-term solution. The longer-term solution was the null core's secondary output port. Experimental reactor cores in this class were designed with multiple output channels, and one of those channels was reserved for electrolysis capacity, which meant it could split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. I needed water. The station had ice on every surface. I needed a containment system to melt and collect it, tubing to feed it to the electrolysis port, and a separation chamber to collect the oxygen and safely vent the hydrogen. I had the parts for all of that somewhere in this station. I knew this because I had spent my career learning to look at a situation not as what it was, but as what it could be made into, with what was present. I spent the morning on the specimen lockers. Both the viable ones were accessible. I vented their internal atmospheres slowly into the circulation system, watching my suit's external sensors confirm the oxygen level in Deck 3 rising from near vacuum to something measurable. It was not breathable yet, but the direction was right. In the afternoon, I began building the water collection system. I scraped ice from the walls of Deck 6 using a tool I fabricated from hull plating and a piece of the shelving unit from Deck 5. I found a sealed coolant reservoir near the maintenance level that still had liquid in it and adapted it as a melt tank. I ran lines from the melt tank to the null core's secondary port. I built the separation chamber from a component housing I stripped from the laboratory level. It took 11 hours. I made 6 errors. I corrected all 6. The last one nearly cost me 3 hours of progress, but I had made the initial installation with redundancy built in, which meant when the primary seal failed, the secondary held, and I had time to fix the primary without losing the whole system. At the end of the 11th hour, the station began producing oxygen. Not a great deal, barely enough to offset what a single person breathed per hour. But it was producing it, and it would keep producing it as long as the null core cycled, and the ice held, and the ice was the interior of the station, which was coated floor to ceiling in the substance. I stood in the corridor outside the maintenance level and did something I had not done since the trial. I breathed fully, not rationing it, just one breath, all the way in, all the way out. Then I went back to work. 4 days passed in that rhythm. Work, sleep 5 hours. Work, eat a quarter of the ration brick. Work. I was not comfortable. I was not safe in any ordinary sense. But I was functional, and functional was a foundation, and foundations were where everything else began. On the 5th day, I found the station's communications array on Deck 2, which was the most structurally compromised level, and required careful movement. The array was partially disassembled. The conclave technicians had removed the primary transmitter module, which would have allowed standard range communication. What they had left was the antenna structure, the signal processor, and the deep archive receiver, which was a passive system that collected and stored all incoming signals without broadcasting anything. They had left it because it appeared, from the outside, to be completely fused to the hull. It was not fused. The housing just looked that way because of heavy corrosion. I cleared the corrosion with a chemical solution from the laboratory level. Underneath, the connection ports were intact. The deep archive receiver could be repurposed, with the right wiring, into a low-power transmitter. Low power meant very short range. Very short range meant limited use. Limited was not zero. I left it for now. I had another priority. The food situation was still temporary. My ration brick would last another 10 days at my current rate of consumption. 10 days was not long enough. The third specimen locker, when I finally opened it on day 6, contained something I had not expected. Not food, not at first appearance. It contained 4 trays of dried organic matter that the Solathi had classified as inert biological debris, meaning they had examined it, determined it had no research value, and sealed it away. What the Solathi had not done, because Solathi do not think in terms of desperation, was test whether inert biological debris was edible. I tested it. The first sample was not edible. I stopped immediately. The second was wrong in a different way. The third had a texture and a faint chemical profile that reminded me of something I had eaten during a survival exercise on a distant world, where indigenous plant life was technically alien to human biology, but contained enough compatible compounds to provide caloric value if processed correctly. I processed it. I ate a small amount. I waited 12 hours. Nothing harmful happened. I ate more. I waited again. Nothing. I had found food. It tasted like boiled moss mixed with nothing. But it was food, and finding food resets the clock in a way that nothing else does when you are calculating how long you have before you run out of options. I started growing it on day 8. The laboratory level had hydroponic trays built into the wall systems, designed for controlled experiments. I cleaned them, filled them with moisture from the condensation that was now forming as the station warmed slightly, and planted fragments of the dried material to see what happened. 3 of 6 trays showed new growth within 4 days. I stood and looked at the pale gray-green growth spreading across the surface of those trays, and I thought about Representative Vreth of the Salathi delegation, who had stood in the sentencing chamber and used a word that translates approximately as, a problem that has been resolved and no longer requires attention. I tended my growing operation and said nothing out loud, because there was no one there. But I thought something with great precision. I thought, not yet. On day 12, the communications array came on without my asking. Not because I had finished working on it. Because while I was reattaching a power line to the signal processor, the station's automated emergency system, which I had not known was still partially functional, detected that the array was being worked on, and ran an automated startup sequence that the Conclave's technicians had failed to disable when they stripped the station. A signal went out. 4 seconds. A standard distress frequency burst that any vessel within a certain range would detect and log. I could not stop it. I stood there with my hand still on the power line and watched the system complete its sequence and go quiet. Someone now knew that Necros 9 was active. I considered that for 30 seconds. Then I continued working on the array. Whoever received the signal would not come immediately. When someone eventually came to investigate, it would be to verify a malfunction, which is exactly what it would look like, because who would seriously consider that the human they had exiled here was still alive after 12 days? Let them come to verify an error. Let them find one life sign in a sealed section of a dead station. Let them run their probability models, built on Salathi assumptions about human endurance, and let those models tell them that the result was anomalous but non-threatening. Let them leave. And then let me keep building. I had given the station a name on day 3, when I had first felt the gravity come on under my feet. I said it out loud for the first time on day 12, standing next to the communications array, in the warm half-light of the restored corridor lighting I had brought back 2 days earlier, using components from the laboratory ceiling panels. I said it quietly, to the walls. Lazarus. Because that was what this place was now. Something that had been declared finished, and done, and past all possibility of continuation, which had not received the message. I had 51 days before anyone would come to check the error log. I had a working power source, a growing food supply, breathable air in 2 decks, functioning gravity, restored lighting in 3 corridors, and a communications array that could send a signal if I needed it to. I also had something else, something I had found late on day 12 while reviewing the archive data that the deep receiver had collected over the 6 years of the station's abandonment. The archive contained records that should not have existed on this station. Records that proved something specific and important and damning. Records that explained exactly why the Salathi had wanted humanity distracted and weakened during the precise years when I was fighting the war they had arranged. I sat in my makeshift living quarters and read those records 3 times. Then I switched off the display and lay still for a long time. I was not angry. I had moved past the kind of anger that makes a person act before they have thought. What I felt was something colder and far more useful. I felt certain of what had happened. Certain of what it meant, certain that somewhere in the galaxy, the species who had arranged my exile were going about their comfortable lives under the assumption that the problem they had disposed of was gone. Certain that they were wrong. I closed my eyes. All right, I said, to nobody, to the station, to the dark outside the hull. Day 12. I slept. When I woke up, I built another oxygen processor, because one was not enough. Then I kept going. The Salathi probe arrived on day 43. I knew it was coming, because the deep archive receiver caught its approach signal 12 hours before it entered sensor range, and 12 hours was exactly what I needed to decide what I wanted it to see. What I wanted it to see was one life sign, one human, alive and confined to a small section of a station that read, on its exterior, as mostly non-functional. I wanted the power readings to suggest minimal survival systems and nothing more. I did not want the probe to detect the null core. I did not want it to see the restored hydroponics, the expanded atmospheric coverage that now reached 4 decks, the mechanical fabrication work I had been doing in the laboratory level for the past 2 weeks, or the communications improvements I had made to the array. Concealing all of that took 9 of the 12 hours. I did it by doing something that Salathi sensor systems are not designed to account for. I layered false load signatures over the real power readings, using the same parallel distribution wiring principle I had applied to the gravity plating on day 1. The probe would see what looked like background radiation noise across most of the station's systems, which was exactly what you would expect from a barely alive station with minimal emergency power. The life sign would be real. Everything else would look like decay. The probe passed through in 6 hours. It ran its scan. It left. I watched it go on the rebuilt sensor system I had been refining throughout the past week, which was now significantly more sensitive than its original specifications, because I had recalibrated the receptor array using a technique from a human engineering research paper published 8 years ago, largely ignored by the broader scientific community because it required a degree of manual calibration that was considered impractical. Impractical for someone with other things to do. I had nothing else. I tapped the outbound signal the probe sent back to Salathi space and read what it logged. The log read, "Subject persisting, anomalous. Monitor interval 6 months." 6 months. I turned that number over in my mind. It was, by any reasonable measure, a substantial gift. I went back to the fabrication lab on Deck 4, looked at the structure I had been building for the past 16 days, and revised my timeline. 6 months was considerably more than I needed for the next phase. I went back to work. The fabrication suite had been designed for Salathi research. Precise, delicate, oriented toward measurement and careful analysis. I had converted it into something else. The tools were the same, but the purpose was entirely different. I was not analyzing anything. I was building. Specifically, I was working on 3 parallel projects. A secondary atmospheric processor to extend breathable air to all 7 decks. A closed-loop water reclamation system to eliminate my dependence on melted ice. And a communications relay capable of pushing a signal far enough to reach human-occupied space. The atmospheric processor was finished on day 51. I walked down to Deck 7 without my helmet for the first time and breathed the air there to confirm what the sensors were telling me. It was cold. It smelled like metal and something faintly organic from the moss spreading through the hydroponic trays 2 decks above. But it was real air, enough to breathe without equipment, and I had made it from nothing. I stood there for a moment and let myself feel that, for exactly as long as it deserved. Then I went back up to Deck 4 and kept working. The water reclamation system was the most technically demanding thing I had built yet. It involved components from 5 different areas of the station, a chemical filtration process I had to develop from first principles because I did not have reference materials for this specific combination of inputs, and 3 complete rebuilds of the primary condensation chamber when the first 2 designs failed in ways that only became apparent under actual operation. The third design worked. I connected it to the station's internal circulation on day 67. The station now had a closed water loop. Atmospheric moisture condensed, was collected, filtered through a mineral processing stage I had built from the ceramic composite containers, split via electrolysis to supplement oxygen production, with the remainder circulating through the hydroponic system. The station was alive, not as it had once been, not close to its original design, but alive in the way that someone who has been badly hurt and has spent a long time recovering is alive, functional, increasingly capable, showing the evidence of hard times on every surface, but no longer in danger of simply stopping. I found the station's artificial intelligence on day 74. I had known a system existed because all conclave science stations used integrated management systems, and because there were interface panels distributed through the station that were not connected to any of the physical systems I had worked on. I tracked their connection back through the wiring over 3 days and found a processing unit in a sealed housing behind a Deck 2 wall. The unit had been running on its emergency power cell, which had been very slowly depleting, and was currently operating at approximately 4% of its normal capacity. 4% was enough to be technically functional. It was not enough for coherent operation. The system was running basic maintenance loops, preserving its data archives against the cold and the years, and waiting in the only way a machine that is barely thinking can wait. I connected it to the station's power grid. It came online slowly, not all at once. Piece by piece, the way a person wakes up from a very long sleep and reaches for memories that are further away than they should be. After 20 minutes, text appeared on the interface panel. Environmental status unknown. Awaiting input. I said, speaking to the panel. Environmental status is stable. 4 decks breathable. Gravity functioning. Power stable from secondary source. You have been offline for approximately 6 years. There was a pause of about 8 seconds. Acknowledged. This unit has fragmented operational data. Full reconstruction may require time. What is the current operational mandate? Survival and reconstruction of the station, I said. Secondary mandate. Gathering and organizing information. Another pause. Longer this time. Partial records available. Pre-evacuation logs are intact. Classified archives are sealed pending authorization. Authorization. Cale Dorn. Former commander. Human Unification Forces. Currently the sole occupant and therefore commanding officer of this station, under emergency operational protocol. The pause that followed was 11 seconds. Authorization accepted. Classified archives available for review. This unit also notes the presence of a previously unlogged reactor system in the maintenance level. This unit is curious how operational status was achieved without access to standard station power. I looked at the panel. I used what was available. Understood. This unit will begin reconstruction of fragmented systems. This unit requests a designation. Echo, I said. Designation accepted. Good morning, Commander Dorn. Good morning, Echo, I said. Let us get to work. Echo was not what the station's original system had been. That one had been fully integrated, capable of managing every aspect of station operation simultaneously. What I had now was more like a very well-organized record keeper, with the capacity to learn and, slowly, to make connections between pieces of information that I might miss. That quality turned out to be useful in ways I had not anticipated. The first significant connection Echo made was on day 77, and it was the one that mattered most. Echo had been reviewing the classified archives that the deep receiver had collected over 6 years, and that my own earlier review had found contained records of Salathi communications during the war years. Echo had cross-referenced those records with the station's own operational logs from before the evacuation, and found something I had not caught. The records in the archive were not just evidence of what the Salathi had done, they were the actual communications, logged in real time by a monitoring system the Salathi had not known this station possessed. It was not just evidence of what had happened, it was the complete planning record. Names, dates, specific decisions, who had decided what, when, and why. Every step in the process that had led to the war, and to the circumstances that had led to my exile, was documented in the actual words of the people who had arranged it. Echo displayed this finding in a brief summary on the panel. I read it twice. Echo, how confident are you in the integrity of this data? Confidence level is 97.4%. The remaining uncertainty is attributable to minor data corruption in 4 of the archive transmissions, which does not affect the core content. And if this data were broadcast on a frequency accessible to human receivers, how difficult would it be to suppress afterward? Suppression would require simultaneous interdiction of all human-accessible communication networks. That action would itself be detectable as an act of interference, and would likely draw more attention to the content than allowing it to propagate. In other words, once it was out, no taking it back, no containing it. I stood still in the corridor outside the system housing for a long time. I was thinking about sequence, about the difference between having something and using it well. The data existed. It was intact. It told a story that every human alive deserved to hear, and that every member of the conclave who had voted for my exile deserved to answer for. But broadcasting it now, from a station with limited range, to an uncertain receiving party, without any preparation for what came after, was not a plan. It was a reaction, and I had spent 2.5 months not reacting. I had spent 2.5 months building, one careful decision at a time, because I understood that the right thing done at the wrong moment produced the wrong result. The data needed to go out at exactly the right time, when there was a prepared receiving party, when I had enough capability that this station could not simply be removed as a consequence of what it had transmitted. I was not there yet. Echo, I said, encrypt the archive using every protocol you have available, layered, and begin calculating the range and power requirements for a deep space transmission using the current communications array. Understood. Estimated time to complete encryption, 4 hours. Preliminary calculation. The current array is capable of reaching human-occupied space at low signal strength, with an estimated transit time of 11 to 18 days depending on conditions in the intervening space. Keep that calculation updated as I make improvements to the array. Noted. Commander Dorn, this unit also wishes to flag that the station's external sensor array is now capable of detecting approach vectors for vessels entering the system. This unit recommends establishing a watch protocol. Set one up, I said. Alert me to anything that enters within 2 million kilometers. Watch protocol established. This unit will monitor continuously. I went back to the fabrication lab. There was a communications relay to finish, and after that there were 23 other improvements on my list, and none of them were optional, and the order in which they were completed was not arbitrary. Every decision I had made for the past 77 days had been part of a sequence, and the sequence was not finished yet. On day 80, I built a dedicated power shunt for the communications array and increased its output capacity by 60%. Not enough to broadcast a detailed message to human space, but enough to send a tight beam signal, compressed, encrypted, precisely aimed at a receiver frequency that only one person in the known galaxy would have still been monitoring. I composed the signal carefully. Not a plea, not a declaration, just information, specific and verifiable. I sent it on day 81 and went back to work. The days that followed were the most productive stretch of the exile so far. I had a rhythm now. The station had systems that ran without constant attention, which meant I could apply more hours to new construction rather than maintenance. Echo managed the monitoring and flagged anything that required my immediate response, which so far had been nothing, and I focused on the 2 projects that I believed would matter most when the situation eventually shifted. The first was defensive. The station had no weapons. I had no intention of building weapons in the conventional sense, but I had a great deal of intention of ensuring that anything that approached Lazarus was detected early, tracked continuously, and understood that the station could make their approach complicated if it chose to. I rebuilt the targeting sensors from the wreckage of the original array, not because targeting sensors fire things, but because a sensor that is actively tracking a ship is a very clear communication. The communication is, I know you are there. I know exactly where you are, and I am choosing not to do anything about it right now. That is a message with real weight, and it does not require ammunition. The second project was the deep archive itself. I had the data. I had encryption on the data. I needed a delivery mechanism that could survive an attempt to suppress it. Echo and I spent 12 days designing a broadcast protocol that used the null core's unique energy signature as a carrier wave. The null core, being undetectable on standard scans, would not show up as a transmission source. The signal would appear to originate from a location in space where no station existed. By the time anyone traced it back to its actual origin, the signal would already be spreading too widely to stop. It was, as Echo noted on day 91, an elegant solution. I told Echo that elegant was not the goal. Effective was the goal. Echo said, noted. This unit will endeavor to be less aesthetically complementary in future technical assessments. I almost smiled. On day 91, the answer to the signal I had sent came back. It bounced through 3 encrypted relays, compressed into a burst so brief that Echo only caught it because the receiver I had rebuilt was many times more sensitive than any standard array. The decryption took 40 minutes because the encryption was human military grade, the same grade I had used to send mine, which told me something important about the sender before I even read the content. The text resolved on the panel, and I read it twice. Received. Transmission origin logged. Requesting confirmation of capability and evidence type. Standing by. 7 words. But they told me 2 things. The first was that the person who sent this was already moving. You do not say standing by if you are waiting for permission. You say standing by if you are already committed and need more information before the next step. The second was that the situation in human space was not what it had been when I left. A standing position implied resources. Resources implied planning that had been underway before my signal arrived. I sat at the communications panel and began composing my reply. It was thorough and precise. It contained a compressed summary of every piece of classified data in the archive, a description of the station's current capabilities, and an honest assessment of what I needed and what I could provide. I sent it on day 92. Then I went back to the fabrication lab, because waiting and working were not mutually exclusive. On day 99, Echo flagged an approach vector, a contact entering the system from an angle that suggested deliberate avoidance of the approach corridors that conclave monitoring buoys typically watched. The vessel was running without a transponder, which is not how you move through space if you are worried about being stopped. It is how you move if you are worried about being logged. The ship held position at 40,000 kilometers and did not broadcast anything. I let it sit there for 2 hours. I watched it on the sensor display. It was not leaving. It was not coming closer. It was waiting in the precise way that a careful person waits when they have committed to a course of action, but not yet confirmed the action is safe. I opened a channel on a frequency I had already calculated they would be monitoring, because if they had found me, they had received my broadcast, and if they had received my broadcast, they had my signal protocols. I said, "You are welcome to dock. Bay 2 is clear. You should know the targeting sensor is tracking you, and that this is information rather than a threat." 30 seconds of silence. Then a voice, slightly distorted by distance, said, "Kale Dorn, you sound exactly as I remember." I recognized the voice, and it was not who I had expected. Not human. Keth. And the Keth were supposed to be gone, driven into the unmapped spaces of the galaxy by a campaign of pressure and displacement that the Conclave had funded, and the Solathi had designed, and that had, over a century, reduced a civilization of hundreds of millions to a scattered remnant of nomads. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Come in slowly. I will open Bay 2. The ship came in. The person who stepped out into the docking corridor of Lazarus was a Keth named Seville, who I had never met, who had traveled a long way through dangerous space to be here, and who was carrying, in the data core around their neck, something that would change every calculation I had made about what came next. I met them at the airlock with the targeting sensor standing down and the corridor lights set to a warm level, rather than the emergency white I normally kept them at, because small gestures matter when you are asking someone to trust you in a place they have never been. On the word of a species they have every reason to be cautious about. Saval looked at the corridor, at the warm air, at the lights, at the faint sound of the hydroponic fans running in the deck above, and they said, in clear and careful human standard speech, "You have done more with this place than we believed was possible." "I had time," I said. "Come and sit down. There is something that grows here that is technically food, and we have a great deal to discuss." We went to the mess hall on Deck 3, which I had restored to basic functionality on day 60, and I made 2 portions of gray moss in the small heating unit I had built from laboratory components, and we sat across from each other at the only table I had salvaged from the storage deck, and Saval put the data core on the table between us. "We received your signal," Saval said. "All of it. We already knew about the Solathi. We have known for 80 years. We have been collecting our own evidence in the spaces between their attention, from sources inside Conclave administrative posts who had their own reasons for quiet cooperation, and from our own direct experience of what the Solathi are willing to do when they want a problem to disappear. We could not use it because we had no platform, no credibility with the galactic community, no partner that the rest of the galaxy would listen to." I looked at the data core. "And now?" Saval looked at the station around them, at everything I had built from a frozen graveyard and a dead reactor and the contents of a mechanical spares container left by someone I had never met. "And now," they said, "you have a platform." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that came next, waiting to be decided and built and made real. I picked up my fork, which I had also fabricated, because the station had not come with silverware. "Tell me everything," I said, Start with what you can bring to this, and I will tell you what I can offer in return. We will work out the rest after that." Saval began to speak. I listened carefully. Outside the hull, the star that this system orbited cast its thin, cold light across the station's exterior, and the station caught it and held it, and the name I had given the place seemed more true than ever. Things that are supposed to be finished sometimes are not. That was, as it turned out, the most inconvenient fact in the galaxy for the people who had decided I was finished. Saval stayed for 3 days before returning to their ship, and in those 3 days we built something that I could not have built alone. An agreement between two kinds of survivors. The first day was mostly listening. I had not spoken to another person in over 90 days, not counting Echo, and there was an adjustment to doing it again that I had not anticipated. Not discomfort exactly. More like the recalibration that happens when you have been running a piece of equipment under one set of conditions for a long time, and then the conditions change and the equipment has to adjust without losing function. I asked questions carefully. I let Saval answer without interrupting. I paid attention to what they chose to say and what they chose not to say, because the shape of what someone omits tells you as much as the shape of what they include. What Saval chose not to say, at first, was why they had come specifically to find me. The Keth had records. The Keth had evidence. What they had not had was a reason to believe that a human with no institutional support, no resources, and no obvious allies could be a viable partner for what they were trying to do. That part came out gradually, through the second evening, when we had moved past the formal exchange of information and into the kind of conversation that happens between people who are beginning to trust each other, but are not there yet. Saval said, "We monitored the distress signal. We had people watching this system from a distance because this station was in our records as a location connected to events we were already investigating. When the signal went out and was logged as anomalous by the Conclave, we waited. We expected them to send a vessel to confirm the malfunction and log it as resolved." I said, "They sent a probe on day 43. "Yes," Saval said. "We watched that probe arrive and leave. We read the transmission it sent back, because we had the same monitoring capability you are building now, just positioned differently. The transmission said, 1 life sign, anomalous, interval extended to 6 months. We ran our own assessment at that point. Our assessment said that a single human surviving in this station for 43 days was not an anomaly. It was a deliberate act. And a deliberate act at this location, given what we knew about what this station contained, was something we needed to understand." I said, "So you came to investigate?" Saval said, "We came to see if you were who we needed." That was an honest answer. I respected it for being honest. "And?" I said. Saval looked at the mess hall around us, at the warm air, and the working lights, and the sound of the systems I had built running quietly through the station's bones. "You are not who we needed," they said. "You are more than that. You are what we would have needed if we had known to look for it." The Keth were not what I had expected. In the intelligence briefings I had received during the war, they had been described in clinical terms: a displaced civilization, pre-industrial by conclave standards, culturally fractured by a century of forced dispersal. The person sitting across from me in the mess hall of Lazarus was none of those things. Seville was precise, methodical, and had spent their life studying the Salathi with the focused attention of someone who intended to outlast them. They had been doing what I had been doing for 2.5 months, except they had been doing it for 80 years. The difference was scale. The Keth had records. Detailed records, collected from Salathi communications they had intercepted in the spaces between inhabited systems, from sources inside conclave administrative posts who had their own reasons for cooperation, and from their own direct experience of what the Salathi were willing to do when they wanted a problem to disappear. The records I had found in the Lazarus archive were the most recent and the most specific. The Keth records provided the broader history that gave the archive its full meaning. Together, they were not just evidence. They were a case, the kind of case that does not leave room for alternative interpretation. When Seville left on the morning of their 4th day aboard, they took a copy of the archive and left 2 of their ships behind, not their main vessel, which continued outward on a route I was not told about, but 2 smaller craft, older models, repurposed from designs that had not been manufactured anywhere in the conclave for 40 years. The Keth had a talent for maintaining things past the point where everyone else assumed they were finished. I recognized the quality. The Keth crew members who stayed were 7 in number. They moved into the restored sections of Deck 5 without ceremony and began doing something unexpected. They asked what needed doing, and they did it. No extended instruction required. They looked at a problem and solved it, and when they encountered something they did not understand, they asked Echo, who had by this point reconstructed enough of its operational capacity to function as a full coordination system. The difference between working alone and working with 7 additional people was not simply additive, it was transformative. Things that had been on my list for weeks were completed in days. The fabrication lab ran continuously. The hydroponics expanded to fill the remaining empty trays on Deck 4. The atmospheric processors were tuned to the point where the air throughout all 7 decks was now clean enough and warm enough that working without a suit felt completely normal. I spent most of this period on the communications work, because the communications work was where the situation would ultimately be decided. The relay I had been building was not enough. A signal capable of reaching human-occupied space was necessary but not sufficient. What I needed was a signal that could reach human-occupied space, deliver the complete archive data without compression loss, be verified as authentic by a technically sophisticated receiving party, and do all of this in a way that a jamming system could not simply shut down. Echo and I had been working on a solution involving the null core's unique energy signature, and the Keth crew contributed something we had not anticipated. One of them, a quiet individual named Petra, who had spent 20 years as a communications technician before the Keth's last fixed base was rendered uninhabitable by Salathi pressure, had developed a theoretical framework for using overlapping signal frequencies to create a broadcast that could not be suppressed without disrupting every other communication in a wide area simultaneously. Suppressing every communication simultaneously would itself be a visible act. The galaxy would notice, and a galactic audience that noticed the Salathi shutting down all communications at the precise moment that certain information began to spread would draw conclusions that no amount of political management could contain. Petra and I worked on the implementation for 11 days. We rebuilt the communications array 3 more times, incorporating improvements each time. Echo managed the calculations. The Keth crew fabricated components. I provided the strategic framework and, when necessary, made decisions about priorities when 2 legitimate options competed for the same resources. The work itself was unlike anything I had done before, not because it was more technically demanding than rebuilding the station's atmospheric systems or bringing the null core back to full operation, but because it required a kind of thinking I had not used in years, strategic thinking, layered on top of engineering thinking, each one informing the other in real time. When Petra proposed a signal configuration, I was evaluating not just whether it worked technically, but whether it worked politically, whether the way we were sending the data would make it easier or harder for the people who received it to authenticate it, share it, and use it. Petra had been thinking about this problem for 20 years. She had not had the resources to solve it because the Keth had not had a fixed base of operations with a power source capable of driving the kind of array the protocol required. What she had was the complete theoretical framework, every calculation worked out, every failure mode documented, every alternative approach considered and rejected, with a written explanation of why. When she showed me her documentation on the 3rd day of our collaboration, I understood something about the Keth that the intelligence briefings had completely missed. They were not a pre-industrial civilization. They were a civilization that had been systematically prevented from being anything else, and the people who did the preventing had mistaken the external condition for the internal one. The Keth were exactly as sophisticated as the conditions they had been allowed to operate in had made them appear, and in the conditions they actually had, which were the conditions of people who had spent 80 years doing precise, careful, dangerous work while being told they were not capable of it, they were remarkable. I told Petra this on the 5th day of our collaboration, not to be kind, because it was true, and because I had found that the Keth responded well to being told true things clearly, and badly to being told things that were intended to be encouraging but were not quite honest. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Salathi told us, consistently and through many channels, That our approach to this problem was theoretically interesting, but practically impossible. That the energy requirements could not be met. That the suppression resistance protocol was elegant in design, but non-functional in application. I said, "And you believed them?" She said, "We believed that they believed it. We understood that they had every incentive to believe it. What they had was better instruments than we did, and the confidence that came from never having had to build something with nothing. We had fewer instruments and a very clear understanding of what you could do with nothing if you were motivated." I looked at the array on the workbench in front of us, which was on its third complete rebuild and was, for the first time, beginning to look like what we needed it to be. "They were wrong," I said. "Yes," Petra said, without any particular satisfaction, just agreement with a fact. On day 131, we ran the first successful test transmission. It was short, and contained no sensitive data, just a mathematical sequence that a prepared receiver would recognize as a handshake signal. We aimed it at a relay point 3 systems away and waited. The response came back in 14 hours. The response was not what I had expected. It was not a confirmation of receipt from the party I had originally contacted. It was a forward message from that party, carrying a second message from someone else, routed through 4 different relay points to make it untraceable. The second message was from Admiral Yessa Cord. I had served under Yessa for 6 years. She had been the most strategically capable officer in the Human Unification Forces, and had also been the only senior commander who had argued, quietly and without public support, that my prosecution was built on a foundation that the Conclave had carefully prepared, rather than one that had grown naturally from the facts. Her argument had not changed the outcome of the trial, but it had been noted by the parties watching, and apparently by someone who understood its significance. Yessa's message was brief. It said, "I know what you found. I have been building toward the same point from a different direction. The Conclave has issued an ultimatum to human parliament. You have 41 days before the vote. Tell me what you have and what you need." I read that message 5 times. Then I read it a 6th time, because there were layers in those 3 sentences that required careful attention. The ultimatum was new information. An ultimatum from the Conclave to human parliament meant that the Solathi and their allies had decided that the period of quiet management was over, and that the time for direct pressure had arrived. That decision was almost certainly connected to the fact that my exile had not produced a confirmed death, which meant that whatever they had been suppressing was still potentially accessible. They were not afraid of me surviving. They were afraid of what I had found, and they had decided to move before I could use it. 41 days. I sat with Petra and 2 of the other Keth crew members in the mess hall that evening and explained the timeline. They listened. The Keth were excellent listeners. A century of operating under conditions where a single mistake in judgment could end everything had produced a people who did not speak until they had thought carefully about what they were going to say. When I finished, Petra said, "The broadcast capability will be ready in 18 days. Possibly 16 if we modify the secondary amplifier configuration we discussed yesterday." One of the other crew members, a man named Aldrich who had been managing the hydroponic system and turned out to have a precise understanding of station engineering that he had never mentioned, said, "The defensive array needs another week after the communications work is complete. If the timeline is 41 days, we have room." The third, a woman named Rue, who had been working on the water reclamation system and had quietly improved my original design in 4 ways, without mentioning it, until I noticed and asked, said simply, "What do we need from the Kaith fleet?" I told her what I thought we needed, and she left the room to speak to Saval's communication relay without another word. The Keth did not waste time on discussion once a decision had been made. It was one of many things I had come to respect about them in the weeks since their arrival. I went back to the communications room and composed my reply to Yessa. It was long. It was thorough. It was the complete picture of everything I had and everything I knew, transmitted in compressed and encrypted form through the relay we had established. I also included a specific technical description of the broadcast system we were building, so that she could prepare a receiving infrastructure on her end that would be ready when the signal went out. I sent it and went to sleep for 5 hours. When I woke up, I went back to work. The next 14 days were the most sustained period of effort I had experienced since the early weeks of the exile. Everyone on the station was working continuously, sleeping in shifts, eating in the fabrication lab or the communications room, because stopping to go to the mess hall felt like lost time. The Keth crew worked without complaint. I had served with human soldiers for 14 years, and the thing I had come to understand about people under genuine pressure is that the ones who are going to give up do it early, before the hardest work begins, and the ones who are still present after the early weeks understand something fundamental about what they are doing and why. The people on Lazarus understood what we were doing. The communications array was completed on day 145. It was not the same array that had been installed when the station was built. It was not even close. What we had now incorporated Keth communications theory, human engineering principles, the unique properties of the null core's energy output, and Petra's suppression resistance protocol into a single system that had no direct precedent in the known galaxy. Echo ran the first full diagnostic and reported, all systems functional, broadcast capability confirmed at maximum design specification, suppression resistance confirmed at theoretical levels, estimated signal transit time to human-occupied space, 9 to 12 days depending on stellar conditions. 30 days remained before Yessa had said the vote would happen. 9 to 12 days of transit time. The signal needed to arrive before the vote, and it needed to have already begun spreading beyond any single point of containment. The math worked. But math and reality are not always the same thing, and I had learned not to trust a plan with no margin for error. Echo, I said, what is the current approach status? Echo said, no contacts within 2 million kilometers. The system has been clear for 31 days. Long-range passive sensors detect a Salathi communications buoy at the outer edge of the system, which appears to be monitoring. This unit assesses low probability of immediate interdiction. Probability of interdiction within 9 days if we broadcast today. Echo said, moderate. The monitoring buoy would detect a broadcast immediately. Estimated response time for an interdiction vessel to reach this system from the nearest conclave base, 7 to 9 days. The broadcast would have been in transit for that full period before any interdiction vessel arrived. Aldrich, who was standing behind me reading the same display, said, so if we broadcast today, the signal is already traveling before anyone can stop it. And if an interdiction vessel arrives here after the signal is out? Rue asked. I looked at the defensive array readouts on the adjacent panel. What we had built was not a weapons system. It was a sensor and deterrence system, a way of making any approaching vessel aware that they were being tracked with precision and that the station was not as passive as it looked from a distance. It would not stop a determined military force, but it would delay one, and delay was all we needed. Once the signal was out and propagating, destroying Lazarus was a political problem for the conclave, not a tactical solution. Then they arrive and we have a conversation, I said. Are the transmitters ready? Echo said, transmitters are ready. Data package is encrypted and formatted for the broadcast protocol, awaiting authorization. I looked at the room around me. The station hummed with real warmth. 7 Keth and I had turned a frozen graveyard into something that breathed and worked and thought. Outside the hull, in the cold dark of a system that every sentient species in the galaxy had written off as irrelevant, something was about to happen that could not be undone. That was the point. Broadcast, I said. Echo said, broadcasting. The signal went out on day 147, 135 days after I had arrived at Necros 9, with 58 hours of oxygen and a utility knife, and the certainty of everyone watching that I would simply die. I did not watch the transmission go. There was nothing to watch. One moment the data was here, the next moment it was also out there, in the space between stars, moving toward every human receiver and every Keth relay and every independent monitoring station that Petra's protocol had been designed to reach. Moving toward the people who had arranged the war. Moving toward the members of the conclave who had voted for my exile. Moving toward every journalist, historian, legal scholar, and ordinary person in the known galaxy who had been given a specific version of events and who was about to receive the version that was true. I went to the mess hall and made 2 portions of gray moss and ate. After a while, Aldrich came in and made a portion for himself and sat at the other end of the table without saying anything. Then Rue came in, and then 2 more of the Keth crew, and then Petra, and we sat there in the warm air of a station that should have been a tomb, and we did not say very much because there was not very much that needed to be said. The signal was out. Everything else was what came after. Echo flagged the Salathi monitoring buoy's response at the 2-hour mark. The buoy had detected the broadcast. An alert had been sent to Salathi Command. The estimated arrival time of the first response vessel was 7 days. 7 days. I looked at the walls of the mess hall, at the corridor beyond the door, at the faint light of the hydroponic bay visible through the open hatch above the stairwell. 7 days before someone arrived with the intention of making Lazarus stop existing. Let them come. Let them arrive and find a station with fully functional sensors, a defensive tracking array that knew exactly where they were at every moment, and a crew of 8 who had already done the one thing that could not be undone. Let them try to explain to the galaxy that was currently receiving the archive data why they had arrived to destroy the place that had transmitted it. I collected the empty containers from the table and brought them to the cleaning station in the corner of the mess hall and rinsed them with the reclaimed water that the station now produced in sufficient quantity that none of us had to think about it. Then I went back to the communications room to begin preparing the secondary relay that would ensure the signal continued propagating even if the primary transmitter was taken offline, because one was never enough. That was the first thing I had learned here. You always built the second one before you needed it. Echo flagged the first incoming contacts on day 154, exactly 7 days after the broadcast. Not one vessel, 12. I was in the fabrication lab when the alert came through, cutting a panel for the secondary relay housing, and I set down the cutting tool and walked to the sensor display without hurrying, because hurrying would not change what the display showed, and I needed to read the data clearly before I decided what to do with it. 12 ships. The approach vectors indicated they had arrived together, from the same jump point, which meant this was a prepared response rather than a rapid reaction. A rapid reaction would have sent whatever was closest. Sending 12 ships from a coordinated position meant the Conclave had been prepared for this possibility and had already had an interdiction fleet positioned in advance, which meant they had expected the broadcast before I sent it. That was useful information. It meant the classified data I had found was more dangerous to them than even I had assessed. You do not pre-position 12 ships, including what the long-range sensor read as 2 vessels in the mass range of dreadnoughts, against a single station occupied by 8 people, unless what that station contains threatens the entire architecture of your political authority. They were not here to investigate. They were here to remove Lazarus from the situation permanently. I thought about the signal, which was now 7 days out and propagating freely. I thought about the transit time Yessa had described. 23 days remained before the parliamentary vote. The signal would reach its first destinations in 2 more days at most. From there, propagation was automatic and could not be stopped without the suppression action that Petra's protocol would make politically catastrophic for anyone who attempted it. The 12 ships outside had arrived one action too late. Destroying Lazarus now would not put the information back. It would confirm the information. The galaxy was already watching. But the Conclave did not necessarily understand that yet. Or rather, the commander of that fleet might understand it rationally and might still be operating under orders that predated that understanding. Military orders are specific. The political consequences were someone else's problem, written in someone else's briefing. I needed to make the political consequences very clear, very quickly. Echo, I said, open a channel to the lead vessel. Channel open. No response protocol established on their end. They are not expecting communication. That is fine. Broadcast on every frequency they are monitoring, which based on their approach vectors are the standard Conclave military bands. Record and archive everything said. Understood. Broadcasting. I said, this is Commander Cale Dorn aboard Lazarus Station. I am transmitting this message on all Conclave military frequencies, and on a simultaneous open broadcast to the surrounding 3 systems. Be aware that this transmission is being archived by independent relay systems outside this station, and will propagate regardless of any action you take here. Your arrival has been logged. The composition of your fleet has been logged. You are now on record as a Conclave interdiction force, operating in response to a broadcast that has already been received by multiple parties across human space. Anything that happens here from this point forward is also on record. I welcome a conversation. I do not welcome anything else. Silence for 40 seconds. Then a voice came back, not the voice of a military officer following orders without thought, the voice of someone who had received those orders and was now looking at a situation that had not been described in the briefing. The voice said, "Dorn, you are aware that this station exists in violation of several conclave mandates." "This station," I said, "exists because I built it. The conclave deposited me here to die and I chose not to. The legal question of whether my surviving constitutes a violation of something is, I am sure, very interesting to certain lawyers. I am more interested in what you intend to do with 12 ships against a station that has already sent everything you were sent here to prevent." Another pause, longer this time. The voice said, "Stand by." They were communicating with their command structure. That took time. During that time, I asked Echo to run a continuous passive analysis of the fleet's configuration and movement, and I asked Aldrich and Rue to bring the defensive tracking array to full operational status, which meant that every ship in that fleet would now be receiving a precise, continuous tracking signal from the station's sensor systems. Not armed targeting, sensor tracking. The distinction was important. A sensor lock says, "I know exactly where you are." An armed lock says, "I am about to do something about it." I was not about to do anything about it. I was making a very specific communication. Petra came into the sensor room while we waited and looked at the fleet composition on the display. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "2 dreadnoughts. They brought 2 dreadnoughts." "Yes," I said. Petra looked at the station around us, and then back at the display. "They are afraid." "Yes," I said again. That was the thing that people who build fleets sometimes forgot. A fleet is not a sign of power. A fleet is a sign of how much power you need to feel safe. 12 ships, including 2 dreadnoughts sent against 1 rebuilt station occupied by 8 people, was a very specific statement about how unsafe they felt. And unsafe meant the information was already doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The voice came back after 19 minutes. It said, "Dorn, the Conclave Command is prepared to offer terms. Cease any further broadcast activity, surrender the data archive and this station, and accompany our vessel to a designated hearing. In exchange, the interdiction order will be suspended pending review." I said, "No." A pause. The voice said, "I am authorized to inform you that refusal will result in the use of force." "I understand," I said. "I want to be very clear about a few things. First, the data archive is no longer exclusively here. It has been in transit for 7 days, and has already been received by parties outside this system. Destroying this station does not destroy the archive. Second, any use of force against this station is being recorded and will be received by those same parties. Third, I would like you to think carefully about what the historical record will say about the day a 12-ship conclave fleet came to destroy a rebuilt abandoned station because 1 human survived being exiled to it. Think about what that record says about why 12 ships were necessary." Silence. 30 seconds. 60 seconds. 90. The fleet held position. The ships did not move. I sat at the communications station and waited, and while I waited I thought about many things. I thought about the null core running in the sealed room on Deck 7, which was still running at 60% of its capacity, and had not failed once in 154 days. I thought about the filament I had pulled from a dead power coupling on the first day, which I still had, sitting in the corner of the fabrication lab on a small shelf, where I had put it on day 20, without thinking about it, and had left it there, because it seemed like the right place for it. I thought about the gray moss growing in the hydroponic trays, which had expanded from 3 trays to 18 over the course of the exile, and which tasted like nothing pleasant, but which had kept 8 people alive and functional for weeks. I thought about what it meant to build a thing, not to be given a thing, or to inherit a thing, or to occupy a thing that someone else had made ready. To take raw materials and the particular knowledge that you happen to have, and the time that you happen to be given, however it was given, and to turn those materials into something that had not existed before, and that worked, because you had understood the principles behind the working, and had applied them carefully and repeatedly, until the result was what you needed it to be. The Conclave had sent me here to demonstrate something. They had meant the demonstration to be about human limitations. You give a human no tools, and no resources and no support, and you put them in a place that cannot be survived, and then you watch, and what you see demonstrates what humans are, and what they can do when the conditions are set against them. They had gotten their demonstration. It was just not the one they had intended. I sat at the communications station and waited. And while I waited, I also thought about a moment, 11 years ago, on the third day of the campaign that would later be called the Vareth engagement, when I had been facing a strategic situation that had looked, from every conventional angle, like one from which there was no favorable outcome. My commanding officer at the time, a general named Olt Carey, who had been with the Unification Forces since the beginning, had sat down next to me in the field command post and looked at the maps and said, "The problem with an impossible position, Dorn, is that it is only impossible if you are trying to win the way they expect you to win. Change what winning means and see if the position changes with it." I had thought about that observation many times since the trial. Winning in the way the Conclave expected meant finding a way to overcome their military advantage, which was not possible from this station regardless of what I had built. But winning in the way they had not anticipated meant something different. It meant making the cost of using their military advantage higher than the cost of not using it. The fleet was sitting still because someone in their command structure had done that math and found that the costs had changed in the past 7 days. The voice came back 58 minutes after my last response. It said, "Lazarus Station, we are requesting a 48-hour communications hold to consult with Conclave leadership. No action will be taken during this period. Confirm." I said, "Confirmed. I will be here." The fleet held its position. The station held its position. The tracking system kept registering every ship with the same precise attention it had given them since Aldrich activated it. Not because I intended to act, but because accuracy was important, and consistency was a form of communication. Rue brought food to the sensor room at the 18-hour mark and sat with me while I ate, and we watched the fleet on the display together, in the way that people watch something they cannot affect, but cannot stop watching. She said, "Have you done this before?" "This specific kind of standoff." I said, "No." She said, "How does it feel?" I thought about it honestly. "It feels like the space between what you have built and what you are trying to build," I said. "Like standing at the edge of something you cannot see past yet." Rue considered that. She had spent her life on the edge of something that had already been lost, building towards something not yet real. She seemed to find the description accurate. "The Keth fleet received word from Sival," she said. "3 of our ships are en route to this system. They will arrive within 40 hours. That was information I had not had. 3 ships was not equivalent to 12. But 3 additional ships in this system, while the Conclave fleet stood by, was a different equation than 8 people on a station. It meant there was a party outside the Conclave present and watching, and parties outside the Conclave watching made destruction politically complicated for the people trying to keep this quiet. I said, "Good. Tell Sival they should arrive with their transponders active, and their approach announced. Not hidden. Let the fleet see them coming clearly." Rue transmitted the instruction. The Conclave fleet did not respond to the arrival of the 3 Keth vessels, which arrived at hour 31 and took up positions at 60,000 kilometers, clearly present and clearly watching. At hour 46, Echo flagged something different. Echo said, "Commander Dorn, long-range sensors are detecting multiple additional contacts approaching from the direction of human space. Mass signatures consistent with human military vessels. His estimated arrival, 4 to 6 hours. I looked at the display. I looked at the mass signatures. Then I opened a channel to the Conclave fleet and said, "This is Lazarus Station. You may want to look at your long-range sensors in the direction of human space." I did not say anything else. The 48-hour hold expired at hour 47. The Conclave voice did not return with an answer. The fleet did not move. The incoming mass signatures continued to resolve on the display with greater clarity as the vessels came closer. At hour 51, Admiral Yessa Cord opened a channel from the lead human vessel, which was now 12,000 kilometers away and decelerating. Her voice sounded, after a month of one-way messages through encrypted relays, exactly as I remembered it from 6 years of service together. She said, "Lazarus Station, this is the human fleet. We are here as observers. We are not here for a fight. We are here because what happens in this system, in the next several hours, is the kind of thing that requires witnesses." She was not asking for permission. She was stating a fact. I said, "Welcome, Admiral. You are on record." The Conclave Fleet Commander opened a channel 40 minutes later. The voice was different from before. Someone with more authority, patched in remotely after consulting with Conclave leadership and receiving new orders. The new voice said, "Lazarus Station. The Conclave interdiction order is suspended, pending a formal review of the evidence presented in the broadcast of Day 147. All vessels are ordered to stand down. No hostile action will be taken." I waited for 3 seconds to make sure the statement was complete. Then I said, "Acknowledged. I am transmitting a formal acceptance of this communication for the record. Lazarus Station remains on standard operational footing." The Conclave fleet began moving away from the station, slowly and in good order, the way a fleet moves when it has received orders it does not like but has chosen to follow. I watched them go on the sensor display. Aldrich was standing in the doorway. Rue was at the secondary panel. Petra was in the corridor beyond the door. The other Keth crew members had gathered somewhere behind her. They were all very quiet. I watched the display for another minute after the last Conclave ship disappeared from sensor range. Then I said, "Echo, current status." Echo said, "All systems nominal. The station is clear. Human fleet has assumed an observing position at 40,000 kilometers. Keth fleet has moved to a supporting position. No contacts within 2 million kilometers on any approach vector. Commander Dorn, this unit would like to note that the archive broadcast has now been received by approximately 14 independent receivers and is continuing to propagate. Suppression is no longer theoretically possible at any level of effort." "Understood," I said. "Log the current status and begin standard watch rotation." Echo said. "Logged. This unit would also like to note that it is, if the calculation is correct, Day 154. "It is," I said. Echo said, "This unit finds it somewhat remarkable." "Don't," I said. But I said it without heat, and Echo, who had been coming to understand the difference, did not respond to it as a correction. I left the sensor room and walked down the corridor to the mess hall, where I made one portion of gray moss and sat at the table and did not think about the fleet or the broadcast or what came next. I sat there and breathed the warm air of a station that was alive in every sense that word could carry, and outside the hull, for the first time in 154 days, there were human ships. That felt like something worth sitting with for a moment. Then I put my container in the cleaning station and went back to work. There was a secondary relay that still needed finishing, and the defensive array needed a calibration update now that the threat profile had changed, and Echo had flagged 3 systems on Deck 7 that required inspection before the end of the week. The station had not stopped needing attention just because a crisis had passed. That was the thing about a place you had built yourself from nothing. You did not get to stop caring for it just because the immediate situation had resolved. You had made it real by paying attention to it, and keeping it real required the same thing, every day, without exception. I went back to the fabrication lab and picked up the cutting tool I had set down when the alert first came through, and I continued cutting the panel for the secondary relay housing, and the station was warm and alive around me, and outside the hull, for the first time in 154 days, there were human ships. I kept working. Day 154. There was still work to do. Yessa came aboard on day 156, 2 days after the Conclave fleet withdrew. She arrived in a small transport that she flew herself, which was something I had known she was capable of, but had never seen her do. She stepped into the corridor of Lazarus with the particular quality of attention that I had always associated with her, looking at everything at once, assigning it value, filing it. She was not alone. She had brought 2 members of her senior staff, and they stayed at the edge of the corridor and let us have the space to ourselves for the first minute. Yessa looked at me. She looked at the corridor, at the warm light and the clean air, and the faint evidence of everything I had done visible in the repaired panels, and the custom-routed cabling, and the floor plating that had been relayed in sections where the original had been too corroded to salvage. She said, "When they told me the distress signal had been logged as anomalous, I had my technical team run a survival probability assessment for a single human on Necros 9, based on the station's last known condition. I waited." She said, "The assessment returned less than 4% chance of surviving past day 7. I said, The assessment was built on Solathi assumptions about what a human would be looking for. Yessa looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "Yes. That is exactly what I told the assessment team." We went to the mess hall. I made tea. Not the gray moss preparation, which I had been providing to the crew but which I did not want to present to Yessa as a first impression of what the station's resources had become. On day 112 I had found, in the back of a storage locker on Deck 5, a sealed package containing a compressed block of dried plant material that Echo identified as being from a species cultivated by early human space settlements for use as a hot beverage. It was old. But old, in a sealed container, is different from spoiled. I had been saving it for a moment that warranted it. I made the tea, and Yessa wrapped both hands around the container and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The vote is in 19 days. The conclave's ultimatum expires at the same time. When your broadcast hit the first receivers, 12 hours ago by my time, the political situation changed in ways that are still resolving. I need to tell you what it looks like from where I am standing." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The archive data has been received and authenticated by independent technical parties in 4 human systems, 2 Keth relay stations, and 1 monitoring post operated by a minor civilization called the Dorath, who have no political connection to the conclave, and therefore no reason to accept or dispute the data on political grounds. Their authentication is, from a legal standpoint, the most important one, because it cannot be characterized as self-interested." I said, "That was by design. The broadcast protocol was aimed to hit independent receivers before it reached conclave-aligned ones." Yessa nodded. She had understood that from the technical description I had sent. "The Solathi Directorate has issued a denial," she said. "The denial is detailed and appears prepared in advance, which tells me they knew this data existed and had a response ready. The problem for them is that a prepared denial is not the same as a true one, and the Dorath authentication makes the denial very difficult to maintain credibly." I said, "What is the current position of human parliament?" Yessa set down her container. "The vote was going to go badly for us. The conclave's ultimatum was designed to make the cost of any other choice too high. Human parliament was going to vote to comply, which meant renouncing you publicly and allowing the interdiction of this station. That was the calculation 4 weeks ago." She paused. "The calculation changed when your broadcast reached the first receivers 6 hours ago. 4 parliamentary members who had been committed to compliance have publicly withdrawn that position, pending review of the archive data. 3 others have requested an emergency extension of the deliberation period." "Is the extension possible?" I asked. "Galactic law allows for a deliberation extension in cases where significant new evidence bearing on the underlying question comes to light during the deliberation period," Yessa said. "The archive data qualifies. The extension has been requested and the conclave cannot refuse it without acknowledging that they want a vote before the evidence can be examined, which would itself tell the story." I sat with that. The conclave had wanted speed, because speed was the enemy of scrutiny. Every extra day the archive data circulated was a day more people had time to read it and understand what it meant, and form an opinion that was not dependent on what the conclave told them to think. Yessa said, "There is a second issue." I said, "The Solathi." "The Solathi Directorate has formally requested that the conclave convene an internal review board to examine the archive data's authenticity. This is a procedural move designed to occupy time and create an official forum where they can dispute the data with their own technical experts, rather than having it authenticated by independent parties." I said, "What is the Dorath position on the review board proposal?" Yessa almost smiled. "The Dorath have stated publicly that any internal conclave review board would lack the independence necessary to produce a credible finding, and that they would not recognize its conclusions as authoritative. They have also stated that they are prepared to host an independent authentication panel on neutral ground if the conclave wishes to pursue a credible review process. The Dorath were a small civilization with very little political weight in conclave affairs. But very little weight was different from no weight, and their willingness to stand publicly on the credibility of the archive data, while offering a solution that was plainly more legitimate than what the Solathi were proposing, was the kind of move that changes the texture of a political situation without requiring force." "Echo," I said, to the room, because Echo was integrated into the station's audio system and could hear and respond from anywhere. Begin preparing a formal response to the Dorath authentication and a supporting technical document that the independent panel, if it convenes, can use as a primary reference. I want it ready within 48 hours, Echo said, from the small speaker in the corner of the mess hall. Understood. This unit will have a draft for your review within 24 hours. Yessa looked at the speaker with an expression I recognized as recalibration. She had not known about Echo. The technical description I had sent had not included the station's artificial intelligence system, partly because Echo had not seemed directly relevant to the strategic question, and partly because some things are easier to explain when someone is already in the room and can see the evidence themselves. She said, "You rebuilt the station AI." "Partially," I said. Echo is not what the original system was, but Echo is operational and has been a significant part of how this station functions. Yessa looked at the speaker for another moment. Then she looked back at me. "What else do you have that I do not know about?" I told her everything. The Null Core, the Keth Alliance, the defensive array, the water and atmospheric systems, the hydroponic operation, the communications protocol that Petra had designed, the secondary relay I had finished on day 153, and that was now running as a backup broadcast point, in case the primary array was ever taken offline. When I finished, Yessa was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The assessment said 4%. "The assessment," I said, "was built on Salathi assumptions." She said, "I know. I keep returning to that." I said, "What do you need from me for the next 19 days?" Yessa said, "I need the technical documentation for the archive data authentication. I need you to be available for formal testimony if the independent panel convenes. And I need this station to remain standing and operational, because right now Lazarus is the most visible piece of evidence in the galaxy that the Conclave's version of events is not reliable, and physical evidence that you can look at and touch is different from data that can be argued about." I said, "The station will remain standing." She looked at me. "What if the Conclave sends another fleet?" "They already sent one," I said. "They sent 12 ships and 2 dreadnoughts, and they turned around without firing a single shot, and the entire galaxy knows it. Sending a second fleet would confirm everything the archive says about how the Salathi and their allies handle situations they cannot manage politically. I do not think they will send a second fleet." "And if you are wrong?" I looked at the walls of the mess hall, at the corridor beyond the door, at the life the station had become. "Then we will have a more complicated conversation," I said, "but I am not wrong." Yessa stayed for 3 days. Her staff worked with Echo to prepare the authentication documentation. Petra and the Keth crew provided technical support for the independent panel proposal. Aldrich and Rue kept the station running with the same quiet competence they had shown since their arrival. During those 3 days, I had a conversation with Yessa's technical officer, a careful and precise man named Garrett who had spent his career in signals intelligence and who wanted to understand the broadcast protocol in detail. Not just what it did, but why it worked, and why no one had built it before. We sat together in the communications room for 6 hours one evening, while Petra explained the suppression resistance mechanism step by step, and I watched Garrett's expression change as he understood what he was looking at. At the end of the 6 hours, Garrett said, "This is going to change how everyone thinks about communications security. Not just the broadcast application. The underlying principle has implications for every secure channel in use, anywhere in the Conclave." Petra said, "Yes, we know." Garrett said, "The Keth developed this?" Petra said, "The Keth developed this in the spaces between the attention of people who believed the Keth were not capable of developing anything." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is going to be a very uncomfortable thing for a great many people to acknowledge." Petra said, "Yes, we know that too." I did not add anything to that exchange. It seemed complete as it was. The night before Yessa left, she and I sat in the mess hall for the last time, and she asked me what I thought was going to happen in the next 6 months. Not strategically, personally. What I thought was going to happen to me, to the station, to the community that had begun to form here, out of necessity and shared purpose. I said, "The station will keep growing. The Keth have been looking for a fixed base for 80 years, and they have found one. The Dorath installation will bring additional traffic. The archive data will continue to work its way through the political systems of every civilization in the conclave, and that process will produce consequences that I cannot fully predict, but that will all share one characteristic. They will make it harder for the Solathi to do what they did before, without everyone knowing immediately what they are doing and why. She said, "And you personally?" I said, "I will keep working. There is a deck to restore. There are systems to improve. There are people here who need a station that functions correctly, and a station that functions correctly needs continuous attention." She said, "Is that what you want?" I thought about that honestly, the way I had tried to think about everything in this place honestly, because this was not a location that rewarded self-deception. You either understood your situation correctly, or the situation corrected your misunderstanding for you, and the corrections were rarely comfortable. I said, "I want what is real. This is real. Everything else will become clear in time." Yessa nodded, as if that answer had told her something she needed to know. She left the next morning, and the station settled back into its rhythm, and I went back to work. On day 159, the conclave formally acknowledged the deliberation extension request and agreed to allow the Dorath-hosted independent authentication panel to convene. The Solathi Directorate's response was described by Yessa's political staff as controlled, but clearly not what they had wanted. On day 163, the authentication panel convened on neutral Dorath territory. The archive data was examined by 6 independent technical analysts from 3 different civilizations. Echo transmitted the full technical documentation of the broadcast protocol and the data collection methodology at the panel's request. On day 167, the panel released its findings. The archive data was authentic. The panel's conclusion was precise. The communications contained in the Necros 9 Deep Archive were verified as genuine records of Solathi governmental communications during the period in question. The methods used to collect and store the data were consistent with standard conclave monitoring protocols. No evidence of fabrication or alteration was found. I was in the sensor room when Echo relayed the panel's finding, and I read it on the display, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt something more like the sensation of a door closing correctly, the kind of solid, unambiguous result that tells you the thing you were trying to do is done. "Echo," I said, "archive the panel's finding alongside the original data and update the secondary relay with the new documentation." Echo said, "Archived and updated." "Commander Dorn, the parliamentary vote is in 2 days." I knew. I had been counting. Yessa called from the fleet at the 16-hour mark before the vote. She said the current assessment showed a shift of 11 parliamentary votes from compliance to refusal since the panel's finding had been released. She said the conclave's ultimatum had been formally challenged as legally void on the grounds that it had been issued in bad faith, which was a legal argument rather than a strategic one, but which had the practical effect of removing the time pressure that the ultimatum had been designed to create. She said she thought the vote would go the right way. I said, "What does the right way look like from where you are standing?" She said, "Human parliament refusing to comply with the ultimatum. The conclave being unable to enforce it without a military action that would, given current conditions, produce consequences they cannot absorb." I said, "And what happens after that?" Yessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Solathi Directorate has to answer for what the archive says they did. Not immediately, not in one action, but the record is permanent now, and the record changes what is possible for them going forward. The galaxy does not forget authenticated evidence." I said, "No, it does not." After the call, I sat in the sensor room for a while. The display was quiet. The system was clear. Outside the hull, Yessa's fleet was at 40,000 kilometers. The 3 Keth vessels were at 60,000. The station was warm and running and breathing. I was thinking about the first day, about the airlock making a sound like a breaking bone, about 58 hours of oxygen and a utility knife, and the absolute certainty of everyone watching that the situation was resolved and would stay resolved. I was thinking about day 3, when I had named the station, and how the name had felt presumptuous at the time, and how it had felt more true with each passing day. I was thinking about Petra and Aldrich and Rue and the 4 other Keth crew members who had come here on the word of a species they had every reason to distrust and had worked without complaint, and had helped turn something impossible into something merely very difficult. I was thinking about Echo, who had come back from a very long sleep and asked what the mandate was, and accepted the answer and got to work. The vote happened at the scheduled time. I did not watch the proceedings in real time because the transmission delay from the Parliament's location meant the result would arrive before a real-time feed could, and there was no sense in watching something incomplete when the complete version was 14 hours away. I spent those 14 hours doing maintenance work on Deck 7, which had been on my list for 3 weeks, and had been delayed by more urgent priorities. I replaced 3 atmospheric system components that had been showing wear indicators on Echo's diagnostics. I recalibrated the gravity plating in 2 sections, where the output had drifted slightly below optimal. I checked the water reclamation filters and found 2 that needed replacement and replaced them. When the result came in, I was at the Deck 7 workbench, cleaning a sensor relay housing that had accumulated a film of particulate from the atmospheric processors. Echo said, through the Deck 7 speaker, "The parliamentary vote result has been received. Human Parliament has voted to refuse compliance with the conclave ultimatum. The margin was significant." I set down the housing and the cleaning cloth. I sat there for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you, Echo." Echo said, "This unit notes it is currently day 169. "I know," I said. Echo said, "This unit finds the progression from day 1 to day 169 to be a subject of some significance." "So do I said. "Get me a full status report for the station in the next hour. I want to know what still needs work." Echo said, "This unit will have the report ready." "There is, Commander. Quite a list." "There always is," I said. I picked up the sensor relay housing and the cleaning cloth and finished what I had started. Outside the hull, the vote had happened. The archive was permanent. The station was standing. The signal was everywhere it needed to be. It was not over. Not the work that remained. Not the conversations that would follow. Not the long process of making what was true into what was recognized and acted upon. None of that was over. But the moment when it could have gone the other way was past. I cleaned the housing and reinstalled it, and checked the readings and moved on to the next item on the maintenance list. Day 169. There was still work to do. 3 weeks after the parliamentary vote, the Solathi Directorate began to fracture. I watched it happen through Echo's monitoring of public communications, through the reports Yessa sent from the fleet, through what Saval transmitted from wherever the Keth main vessels had repositioned themselves in the space between systems that mapped to no civilization's territory. The fracturing was not fast, and it was not dramatic. It was the kind of slow structural failure that happens when the foundation of a thing turns out to have been built on a falsehood, and the falsehood becomes impossible to maintain, and the thing begins to show the truth of its actual load-bearing condition. Representative Vreth, who had stood in the sentencing chamber and called my exile generous, resigned from the directorate on day 192. The official reason given was personal health considerations. The actual reason was visible in the public statements of 6 other directorate members who had, in the days preceding the resignation, distanced themselves from the positions Vreth had held. Vreth had been the public face of the policy. The other members had decided that the public face was now a liability they could no longer share. I read the resignation notice on Echo's display in the fabrication lab, where I was building a 4th atmospheric processor, because 3 was the minimum for a station of this size running at full occupancy, and full occupancy was becoming a real condition, rather than a theoretical one. 4 additional Keth vessels had arrived in the system in the 10 days since the vote. They were not military. They were something more interesting. 3 were transport vessels carrying supplies that the Keth community had been moving between their dispersed locations for years, and one of them was what Saval had described, in a transmission from 3 days prior, as a technical contingent of people who had been planning how to use a fixed base of operations for purposes they had been unable to pursue from mobile platforms. The Keth had been planning for a fixed base for a long time. They had believed, for a long time, that having one was not possible. The existence of Lazarus had changed that calculation. I understood the feeling very well. The technical contingent included 11 people with specific skills in areas I had been managing with improvised solutions for months. A structural engineer named Wallace, who looked at the Deck 2 damage assessment and said, without any particular drama, that he could have that section fully restored in 8 weeks, if I could provide the materials. A systems architect named Cora, who reviewed Echo's reconstructed operational framework and spent 2 days working directly with the system before emerging from the communications room and telling me, with the expression of someone who has found something they were not expecting to enjoy, that Echo was a more sophisticated system than its design specifications suggested, and that the modifications made to its operating framework during recovery had produced several emergent behaviors that were worth documenting carefully. I had noticed the emergent behaviors. I had not said anything about them to Echo directly, because I was not certain what the right thing to say was, and in the absence of certainty, I had continued working with Echo the way I always had, which seemed to be working well enough. Cora and Echo had a long conversation that I was not part of, and afterward, Echo's responses had a quality of precision that was slightly different from before. Not better or worse, exactly. Just more deliberate, as if something had been examined and confirmed and filed correctly in a way it had not been before. I did not ask about it. Some things develop on their own timeline and are better for not being interrupted. On day 200, Yessa returned to Lazarus. This time she came without her senior staff. On a transport she flew herself, which docked at Bay 2 in the careful way of someone who has studied the bay configuration in advance and wants to get it right on the first attempt. She came through the airlock and looked at the corridor again, the same way she had the first time, but the calculation in her eyes was different because the information available to it had changed substantially. She said, "You have more people here." "The Keth technical contingent arrived 2 weeks ago," I said. "Wallace is working on Deck 2. We should have full structural integrity in 6 more weeks." She said, "I need to tell you something that is not comfortable to say." I said, "Say it." She said, "The conclave is going to call for a formal review of your conviction, not because they want to, because the political situation has changed to the point where maintaining the conviction without review is more damaging to their authority than conducting one. The review will likely result in the conviction being overturned." I looked at her. I said, "On what grounds?" She said, "On the grounds that the evidence used to support the conviction has been demonstrated to be part of a deliberate political operation by parties who had an interest in the outcome. The Dorath authentication report will be the primary reference. The panel's finding supports an argument that the prosecution was not conducted in good faith." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "What does an overturned conviction mean, practically speaking?" Yessa said, "It means you are not a criminal under galactic law. It means your rank is restored. It means you have legal standing to make claims against the parties responsible for the prosecution, which is a long process, but one that is now open." I looked at the walls of Lazarus, at the warm corridor, at the repaired lighting, at the panels that carried the evidence of 200 days of attention and decision and refusal to accept a situation as final. I thought about what I had when I arrived and what I had now. I thought about what the word criminal meant to the conclave when they used it, and what it meant to me when I looked at the station I had built. I said, "The review will take how long?" She said, 18 months, possibly less, given current political conditions. I said, "Then in 18 months there will be a finding. In the meantime, there is a station that needs work, and a community that is building something here, and I am not interested in going anywhere." Yessa looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I expected you to say something like that." I said, "Did you want me to say something different?" She said, "No. I wanted to make sure the option existed before the conversation moved forward." She paused. "There is also a request. From the Dorath." I said, "What kind of request?" She said, "The Dorath Monitoring Authority has been operating an independent communications relay network for 60 years, without a fixed base in this sector of space. Their relay coverage has gaps they have not been able to fill from mobile platforms. They are asking whether Lazarus would be willing to host a Dorath relay installation." I thought about what that meant in terms of the station's structure and operation. What does hosting a relay installation mean, specifically? She said, "A Dorath technical team of approximately 8 people, a physical installation on the outer hull in the communications array section, and a formal affiliation with the Dorath network, which would provide a degree of independent political protection that the station currently lacks. Independent political protection. What she meant was that destroying Lazarus would become an act against not just the humans and Keth on it, but against the Dorath network, which was a third party with no stake in the original dispute, and therefore the hardest kind of party to justify acting against, without producing the precise kind of galactic attention the Solathi were currently trying to avoid. I said, "Tell the Dorath the answer is yes. Ask them to send their technical team at their earliest convenience." Yessa said, "I already told them you would say yes." I said, "That was presumptuous." She said, "I have known you for 6 years." We went to the mess hall. I made tea from the last of the preserved block I had been using carefully since day 112. Yessa sat across from me and wrapped her hands around the container the same way she had the first time. She said, "How are you?" I considered the question. It was not the kind of question that needed a strategic answer. It needed an honest one. I said, "I am better than I have been in a long time. That is not what I expected to be able to say about this situation." She said, "What did you expect?" I said, "I expected to be alive if things went reasonably well, and to be otherwise if they did not. I did not expect any of this." I looked at the table, at the container in my hands. What they sent me here to do was stop. Stop being a problem. Stop mattering. Stop existing in a form that was inconvenient for their calculations. I understood that when they sentenced me, I decided not to do it. She said, "You decided to rebuild instead." I decided not to stop, I said. The rebuilding was what not stopping looked like in this particular location. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Vreth is gone. You should know that. Not just from the Directorate. Gone in the sense that he has left Solathi space entirely. The public statement says personal reasons. The actual reason is that the weight of what is documented in the archive became too specific to ignore and too public to manage. He left for the outer edge of mapped space, as far as I have been able to determine." I said, "Let him go." Yessa looked at me. "You do not want anything to follow him?" I said, "What the archive does is what it does. It does not need my assistance. The record is permanent. That means the consequences of what is in the record are also permanent. Wherever he goes, he carries the documented decisions he made. That does not change. That follows him without any effort from me." She thought about that for a moment. After Yessa left, I went back to the fabrication lab and worked on the atmospheric processor until late in the night cycle, which the station now observed on a regular schedule, because a community of people is healthier when it shares a rhythm. The work was precise and careful, and required the same quality of attention that all of the work on Lazarus had always required, and I gave it that attention without resentment, because the work was real, and real things deserved to be done correctly. Wallace was on deck too, which I could hear faintly through the structural connections of the hull, the sound of restoration in progress, sections being made whole that had been broken since before I arrived. Cora was in the communications room, working on something with Echo that had been running for 3 days and that Echo had described, when I asked, as a systems optimization project that this unit finds interesting and prefers not to have interrupted until it is complete. I had not interrupted it. The Dorath team arrived on day 209, 8 people, quiet and methodical, who spent their first 3 hours walking every accessible section of the station with small instruments and making careful notes. Their team leader, a man named Owen who turned out to have known 3 human engineers personally from a joint project 12 years ago, found me in the fabrication lab and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at what I was building before he said anything. He said, "The Dorath Monitoring Authority has been operating for 60 years. We have hosted relay installations on a great many platforms of many different kinds. I want to tell you something that we do not usually say to the operators of the platforms we work with." I looked up from the work. I said, "Go ahead." He said, "This station is remarkable, not because of what it was designed to be, because of what it became. We reviewed the technical history from the archive data and from Echo's logs. The approach taken here has produced solutions to problems that our own engineering teams have been working on for years. Some of what you built here, especially the parallel load distribution systems and the null core integration methodology, we would like to study and learn from, if you are willing to share it." I said, "I am willing." Speak with Echo about access to the technical documentation. Echo will provide whatever you need. Owen said, "Thank you." He paused. "There is one other thing. The Monitoring Authority names its relay installations after the stations that host them. We would like to confirm that the name of this station is Lazarus." I said, "It is." He said, "Then the Dorath relay installation here will be the Lazarus relay. It will be entered in our official registry as a permanent installation." After he left, I sat in the fabrication lab for a few minutes and thought about that word, permanent, listed in an official registry, something that would exist in the documented record of the galaxy, regardless of whether anyone found it convenient. I had used that word to Yeso when talking about the archive data. The record is permanent. It applied here too, in a different way but with the same meaning. Something that had been built was now real, and real things that are documented persist, and things that persist shape what comes after them. I finished the atmospheric processor and carried it to Deck 7 and installed it in the housing I had prepared, and I ran the startup sequence and watched the readings settle into the range I had designed for, and I confirmed with Echo that all systems were operating within specification. Echo said, "Fourth atmospheric processor online. Total atmospheric capacity now exceeds station requirements at current occupancy by 38%. Commander Dorn, this represents significant surplus capacity." I said, "We are going to need it." Echo said, "This unit concurs. Current population trend suggests full capacity will be reached within 4 months at the present rate." I said, "Then start planning for expansion. What does Wallace think about the feasibility of restoring Deck 1? Echo said, "This unit asked Wallace this question 2 days ago in anticipation of your asking. Wallace says the deck is structurally sound and restoration is feasible within 12 weeks, given current resource levels." He also said, and this unit is quoting directly, that he has been wondering when you were going to ask. I said, "Tell Wallace to start planning. I will review the proposal at the end of the week." Echo said, "Understood. Commander Dorn, it is day 209. "I know," I said. Echo said, "This unit has been calculating the progression from the beginning. On day 1, the station had power in one section, gravity in one section, breathable air in one section, and 1 occupant. As of today, the station has full power across all 7 decks, full gravity across all 7 decks, breathable air across all 7 decks, a closed water system, a functioning food production operation, a restored communications array, a defensive sensor system, a permanent Dorath relay installation, and a population of 31. I looked at the display. Echo said, "This unit thought you might want to hear the comparison stated clearly." I said, "Thank you, Echo." Echo said, "This unit would also like to note that on day 1, this unit was running at 4% capacity on emergency power in a sealed housing behind a wall that nobody had opened in 6 years. This unit would like to state, for the record, that it finds the current situation considerably preferable." I said, "I am glad to hear it." Echo said, "This unit is glad to be heard." I stood in the corridor outside the atmospheric processor installation for a moment, in the warm air of a station that was alive in every sense that word could carry. I could hear voices from Deck 4, the Keth technical contingent, and 2 of the Dorath team, working together on something that had involved a great deal of animated conversation over the past 3 days. I could hear the hydroponic fans. I could hear the fabrication lab 2 corridors away, where someone had taken over a project I had left half done, and was continuing it, which had become normal, which was exactly the thing I had not expected to be possible when I arrived here with 58 hours of oxygen and a utility knife. I walked to the viewport at the end of the corridor. The frost was long gone from the glass. Through it, I could see the star that this system orbited, dim but present, casting its thin light across the hull of Lazarus the way it always had, except that now the hull caught the light and held it and reflected it back in the way that things with real structure do, and the station was not a dead platform in the shadow of a distant star. It was a place, a real one, with people in it who had decided it was worth being in. I put my hand flat against the viewport glass, which was warm under my palm because the station was warm now, all the way to the edges. I did not say anything out loud. There was nothing that needed saying. Then I turned away from the viewport and went back to work. There was a deck to restore, and a relay to integrate, and a population that was still growing, and a list of improvements that Echo kept updated, and that never got shorter, because every problem you solved revealed the next problem that solving it had made visible. And that was not a failure of the station. That was what it meant for a station to be alive. Alive things always have something that needs doing next. I went to find Wallace and start talking about Deck 1, on day 209, in a station that everyone had been certain I would not survive. I was already planning what came after this. That was the only way I had ever known how to do it. One more problem, one more solution, one more day. Lazarus held on, and so did I.